Welcome to the debate. Imagine, just for a second, that you are tasked with bringing a highly reactive, potentially dangerous chemical right into your living room.
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't just toss it on the sofa.
Right, exactly. You wouldn't leave it in an open laundry hamper. You'd establish strict protocols. You'd create a containment system, maybe rely on specialized storage, and, treat the substance with the exact level of mechanical precision it really demands.
Which is a lot easier said than done in a normal house.
Well, sure, but that's what we're digging into today. We're exploring the intersection of outdoor recreation, tick prevention, and feline safety. Specifically, we're looking at permethrin.
Which is a highly effective synthetic pyrethroid. It's, used all the time by hikers, campers, outdoor workers to prevent some really devastating tick-borne illnesses, things like Lyme's disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever.
But the tension we are unpacking here is pretty clear because permethrin is a profound and often fatal toxin to cats. So we're looking at a fundamental debate of risk management versus biological vulnerability. I will argue that by deeply understanding the science of permethrin, we can actually implement rigorous behavioral protocols and storage habits that allow for the safe continued use of this vital tick prevention tool, even in a cat-owning household.
And I look at this entirely through the lens of biological vulnerability. I will argue that the unique metabolic constraints and behavioral patterns of cats make the margin for error just, too perilously thin, rendering strict avoidance the only genuinely safe approach.
I fully acknowledge the extreme toxicity of permethrin to the feline system. It is severe, but I firmly believe exposure is entirely preventable through systemized habits.
Systemized habits?
Yes. If a household utilizes sealed storage for outdoor gear, understands the distinct danger of the wet phase of application, and relies on safe, non-permethrin alternatives for the cats themselves, they can effectively drive the risk down to zero.
Zero is a strong word.
But it's possible. We don't have to sacrifice human protection against severe tick-borne diseases just because a hazard exists. We simply have to manage that hazard with uncompromising precision.
I just can't get behind the idea that human behavioral controls are a sufficient safeguard. I have to push back there. Because biological and chemical realities will always override human behavioral intentions.
How so?
Well, drying permethrin-treated clothing, for example, it doesn't neutralize the chemical. It leaves a highly persistent active residue. And because cats groom obsessively, and because they fundamentally lack the biological mechanism to process this toxin.
A single slip in protocol.
Exactly. A single slip can lead to catastrophic neurological failure. When the consequence of one human error is a fatal outcome, attempting to manage the risk is, I think, inherently flawed.
Okay, to really understand why this is such a high-stakes issue, we have to look at the feline biology itself. Like, why is it that you and I can spray permethrin on our hiking boots, and a dog can have it applied directly to its back in a massive concentration, but for a cat, it's a lethal threat?
It really comes down to evolutionary biology and a very specific metabolic gap. Most mammals, humans, dogs, horses, we process permethrin through the liver using a specific enzyme.
Right.
It's called glucuronosyltransferase, or, thankfully, UGT for short.
Yeah, let's stick with UGT.
Agreed. So when permethrin enters a dog's body, this UGT enzyme basically acts like a chemical wrecking ball. It efficiently smashes the permethrin molecule down into harmless metabolites, and the dog just excretes it in their urine.
Very clean, very efficient.
Exactly. But cats are obligate carnivores, and somewhere along their evolutionary line, they actually lost the genetic instruction to produce adequate amounts of this specific UGT enzyme. They just don't have the biological machinery to dismantle the chemical structure of permethrin.
So the chemical just hits a brick wall in the liver. It literally has nowhere to go.
It hits that roadblock, yes. And because it cannot be broken down and flushed out, it accumulates. And it happens incredibly fast.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the active chemical circulates and crosses directly into the nervous system. At the cellular level, permethrin targets what we call voltage-gated sodium channels.
Which are essentially the tiny gates that control electrical signals in the nerves, right?
Right. Normally, a nerve cell fires an electrical signal. The sodium channel opens up to let the signal pass, and then it slams shut so the nerve can reset.
Okay.
Permethrin physically wedges that gate open. It prevents it from deactivating at all. So instead of a single controlled signal, you get a continuous, uncontrolled barrage of nerve firing. It's like a doorbell that gets stuck down and just keeps ringing and ringing.
And that mechanism perfectly explains the very specific early symptoms you see in permethrin toxicity. Because if a localized nerve is constantly firing, that translates to localized physical spasms.
Spot on. That's why the early warning signs are things like relentless ear flicking or hyperasthesia, which basically looks like their skin is literally rippling or crawling.
It's those wedged open sodium channels forcing the local nerves in the skin to fire without any input from the cat's brain.
Yes, and if the exposure continues, it spreads to the central nervous system, leading to severe body tremors, hypersalivation, dangerously elevated body temperature, and ultimately life-threatening seizures. Because of this physiological reality, there is essentially no safe threshold for a cat.
I hear the severity of that biological mechanism. I really do. But I think we can look at this vulnerability through a different lens.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of it like a severe peanut allergy in a house that bakes with peanut oil. Yes, the person's body lacks the ability to process that protein safely. It triggers a catastrophic immune response. But if you keep the peanut oil locked in a designated cabinet, only use it in a separate room, and meticulously clean the workspace,
The lack of a filter doesn't matter.
exactly. The lack of an allergy filter in the person's body doesn't automatically equal a lethal outcome. The vulnerability only matters if exposure occurs. And the 2026 Toxicology Letters Review actually supports this concept of environmental management.
They do?
Yeah. They describe it as a dose formulation species interaction. The species lacks the enzyme, yes, but the dose requires a pathway into the body.
I see what you're trying to do with the peanut allergy analogy, but I honestly think it falls apart when you look at the messy reality of a home environment.
How so?
Well, a home isn't a sealed, sterile laboratory. It's highly dynamic. And a cat isn't a roommate who understands they shouldn't touch the peanut oil. Cats don't respect containment zones, they don't read warning labels, and crucially, they groom their environment obsessively.
But that's exactly where human behavioral protocols act as the barrier. If owners apply permethrin outdoors, wear gloves during application, and never ever allow cats near wet clothing, the metabolic vulnerability is bypassed entirely.
Sure, the wet phase.
Right. We know that wet phase of application is the most dangerous because the chemical is in a liquid, highly mobile state.
Right. We agree the wet phase is a massive hazard, but there is this pervasive and honestly incredibly dangerous myth that once permethrin-treated clothing dries, the risk simply evaporates. It doesn't. Drying does not neutralize the chemical.
Well, drying removes the liquid carrier. The active ingredient binds to the fabric fibers.
It binds, yes, but it doesn't lock away forever in some impenetrable vault. The Toxicology Letters Review explicitly warns about this. They note that permethrin preferentially partitions into the lipid-rich stratum corneum and forms a persistent cutaneous reservoir.
Let's translate that for a second for the listeners. The stratum corneum, that's basically the outermost layer of the skin, right?
Yes.
So the review is saying the chemical is highly attracted to fats, and it sets up a reservoir in those outer lipid layers of the skin or fur.
Exactly. It loves fat, so even when dry on a pair of hiking pants, it maintains a surface residue. Think about factory-bonded treatments like Insect Shield. They actually bake the permethrin right into the polymer of the fabric, and they advertise that it lasts through 70 washes.
70? Wow.
Yeah. Think about how extraordinarily resilient a chemical has to be to survive 70 cycles in a washing machine with heavy detergent. If your cat rubs its side against those dried hiking pants after you just toss them on a chair, that persistent residue transfers directly to the natural oils in the cat's fur. And what does a cat do right after it brushes against something new?
It grooms itself.
Exactly. And a cat's tongue isn't smooth. It's covered in tiny, backward-facing barbs called papillae. It acts like a highly efficient comb, scraping that chemical residue off the fur and pulling it directly into their digestive tract.
Which brings us back to the UGT enzyme.
Right. Because of the absolute lack of that UGT enzyme we talked about, even that microscopic dry transfer dose can trigger the sodium channel failure.
Okay, I understand the mechanism of transfer, But this persistent cutaneous reservoir is exactly why actionable, rigorous storage tips are the absolute foundation of my argument. We aren't telling people to just let their gear dry and then throw it on the bed.
But people do.
Which is why we need to talk about systemized physical barriers.
Okay, what does that actually look like in practice, though? After an exhausting 8-mile hike, people get lazy.
It has to be an uncompromising habit. For instance, treated backpacks, tents, and sleeping bags, they don't even come into the main living space. They go straight into a closed, secure closet or garage.
A detached garage would be ideal.
Sure, and treated clothing goes immediately into lidded storage bins. Not an open hamper where a cat can jump in and sleep on it, but a heavy plastic bin with a locking lid.
Okay, so a dedicated quarantine bin.
Yes, when you come home, you take off those clothes immediately in a designated area. And this is especially vital if your clothes are damp from sweat, which, can remobilize that bound chemical.
That's a good point about sweat.
Right. Then you wash treated items completely separately on a gentle cycle. By instituting these rigid physical barriers, that persistent residue simply never gets the opportunity to interact with the cat's fur.
I have to push back there again because biology and Murphy's Law are always going to win out over human habits. You're assuming a level of persistent human infallibility that just doesn't exist outside of a textbook.
I think you're underestimating people's ability to form a habit, but okay.
But think about real life. What happens when someone is just dead tired? The lidded bin doesn't get latched properly. Or a guest brings a treated jacket and hangs it on a dining chair without telling you. You set your backpack on the floor for just 5 minutes to unlace your boots. The cat rubs against the backpack, grooms its paw, and ingests the permethrin. A single slip in protocol results in a life-threatening neurological event. When the margin of error is that devastating, attempting to manage the risk is inherently flawed.
But isn't that true of many household hazards? I mean, we keep bleach under the sink. We keep toxic houseplants out of reach.
Bleach doesn't silently transfer to a cat's fur when they walk past a pair of pants.
True, but the key is awareness. An informed owner knows the stakes and maintains the boundary. And I want to scale this up to an even more complex environment. Because if we can manage this in a multi-pet household, it proves that systemic safety is possible. Let's look at homes that have both dogs and cats.
Oh, introducing a dog into this equation multiplies the risk exponentially.
It absolutely introduces more variables, yes. But it's still manageable if we rely on strict, simple safety habits. Sometimes a dog living in a high-tick area absolutely must be treated with a permethrin-based spot-on product. And we have to acknowledge those spot-on treatments can contain concentrations up to 74% permethrin.
74%.
Yes, that is vastly higher than the less than 1% concentration you find on treated clothing.
Which makes the dog a walking, ticking time bomb for the cat.
If they interact, yes. But the veterinary standard here is the strict 72-hour separation rule. You apply the spot on to the dog, and you separate the animals completely for 3 full days. Different rooms, no shared furniture, no physical contact whatsoever.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that as a practical solution. The 72-hour separation rule is almost impossible to execute flawlessly in a standard home. You're talking about maintaining an airtight quarantine in a shared living space for 72 hours.
It requires diligence, but people do it. You keep the dog in the master bedroom and the cat in the rest of the house, or vice versa.
But think about the logistics. Homes have shared ventilation systems. Cats are notoriously adept at slipping through doors the second you open them to bring the dog in from a walk. And let's go back to the mechanism of transfer. That 74% concentration doesn't just stay neatly on the dog's shoulder blades.
Well, it does spread through the lipid layer of the dog's skin.
Exactly, and it transfers to the dog's bedding, it rubs off onto the carpet, it gets on the sofa. If the cat walks across that same patch of carpet a day later, gets it on their paws and grooms themselves, we are right back to the UGT enzyme deficiency and the voltage-gated sodium channel failure.
But we can build a comprehensive parasite defense system that mitigates that. You don't have to use permethrin on the dog.
Exactly. That is my point entirely.
Right, but I'm saying you can manage the household safely by using alternatives. There are highly effective, vet-prescribed topical spot-ons for both cats and dogs that do not contain permethrin.
Yes.
For cats, products utilizing selamectin and sarolaner, or moxidectin and fluorolaner, they offer excellent broad-spectrum protection. You protect the cat with these safe, non-pyrethroid alternatives,
And if you really want to avoid the 72-hour quarantine, you just use a non-permethrin oral preventative for the dog.
I completely agree on using alternatives, but my stance is that avoiding permethrins on the dog isn't just a workaround. It should be an absolute mandate in a multi-pet home. Why voluntarily introduce a 74% concentration of a neurotoxin into a home with a biologically defenseless animal? Opt instead for permethrin-free dog treatments and combine that with rigorous environmental tick control in your yard.
Environmental control is huge. Trimming the grass short, removing leaf litter where ticks thrive, creating a physical barrier of like gravel or wood chips between wooded areas and the lawn.
Yes, those physical landscaping controls drastically reduce tick populations without bringing chemicals into the equation. Combine that with daily physical checks. Running your fingers thoroughly through the dog's fur, checking the groin area, under the collar, between the toes. It relies on human effort, but it doesn't introduce a fatal hazard.
I see the appeal of relying solely on environmental control and daily physical checks for the yard. It's an excellent mechanical prevention method, but we have to remember the context of outdoor recreation.
What do you mean?
Yard control does absolutely nothing for them on the trail. They need permethrin on their gear to protect their own health. The risk of severe, life-altering tick-borne diseases in humans, like alpha-gal syndrome or chronic Lyme, is incredibly high. We shouldn't force people into a binary choice between human health and feline safety when rigorous protocols can protect both.
But you have to admit that when a protocol fails, and human protocols always fail eventually, the consequences are so catastrophic that it invalidates the risk management strategy. Let's look at what actually happens in the veterinary clinic when someone's lidded bin gets left open, or a cat rubs against a damp hiking boot. The treatments required highlight exactly why this chemical shouldn't be in the house at all.
The veterinary interventions are intense, I agree, which is why awareness and immediate action are the protective mechanisms. If you even suspect your cat has brushed against wet treated clothing or a treated dog, you never wait to see if symptoms develop.
Never.
Permethrin poisoning is a severe medical emergency. Speed is everything.
Absolutely. You don't wait for the ear flicking to start. If it's a topical exposure on their fur, the very first step is to bathe them immediately with a mild, grease-cutting dish soap like Dawn. Because permethrin is highly lipophilic, meaning it binds tightly to oils and fats. The dish soap strips the lipid barrier on the fur where the chemical is hiding.
And it is vital to emphasize using lukewarm water for that bath. Never hot.
Right. Can you explain why the temperature matters so much?
It goes back to biology. Hot water stimulates superficial circulation. It physically dilates the blood vessels in the cat's skin. So if you use hot water, you are literally opening up the highways for the permethrin to absorb faster into the bloodstream. It has to be cooled to lukewarm.
That makes total sense.
And crucially, you do not induce vomiting if they've ingested it, unless a veterinarian explicitly instructs you to. Once those neurological symptoms begin, vomiting becomes an enormous aspiration risk.
And once they are at the clinic, the reality of the UGT enzyme deficiency becomes terrifyingly clear because there is no antidote. The vet can't just give them a shot to neutralize the permethrin.
It's all supportive care.
Entirely supportive. To stop the severe tremors, vets have to use heavy muscle relaxants like methocarbamol. If the seizures have taken hold, they're escalating to powerful barbiturates like phenobarbital or pentobarbital. They are essentially having to induce a coma-like state just to stop the brain from short-circuiting.
And in the most severe life-threatening cases, they use intravenous lipid emulsions, or ILE.
Yes, ILE is a fascinating yet harrowing intervention. Because permethrin is so highly lipid-soluble and loves fat, veterinarians will literally administer a fat-based IV infusion into the cat.
It effectively creates a fat sink in the bloodstream, right?
Exactly. They are pumping the bloodstream full of medical-grade fat emulsions so that the permethrin molecules actually unbind from the cat's nerve cells, pulling them away from those voltage-gated sodium channels, and they bind to the circulating fat in the IV fluid instead. It literally acts like a chemical sponge in the blood.
That is incredible.
It is, but it's an incredibly intense, high-stakes medical intervention to counteract a mistake that could have been as simple as dropping a treated sock on the floor. And while cats treated early have an excellent chance of recovery, typically resolving in 48 to 72 hours, delayed treatment is deadly. Sustained seizures dangerously raise the core body temperature, which causes secondary organ damage and irreversible brain injury.
The stakes are undeniably high, which underscores why raising awareness among outdoor enthusiasts is so deeply critical. But acknowledging the severity of the clinical treatment shouldn't paralyze us. It should motivate us to flawless execution of safety measures. Knowing about the lipid emulsion therapy or the importance of a lukewarm Dawn dish soap bath, it empowers an owner.
If they act in time.
Right. Let me summarize where my argument lands. We possess the cognitive ability to engineer a safe environment. By combining meticulous gear storage, lidded bins, isolated washing, strict separation, with the proper use of vet-approved, non-pyrethroid cat preventatives like selamectin and serralanir, households can safely manage the risk of permethrin. We can protect ourselves from devastating tick-borne human diseases while keeping our feline companions entirely safe.
And my position remains that engineering a safe environment around this specific chemical is just an illusion of control. The combination of the cat's absolute UGT enzyme deficiency, the highly persistent chemical residues that remain active and transmissible on dry clothing, and the natural feline instinct to groom obsessively, it makes the environment far too precarious.
It's a tough balance.
It is. The biological reality of the cat will always outmaneuver human intentions. Therefore, relying on behavioral protocols is a gamble where the cat pays the ultimate price, making total avoidance the only truly safe approach.
Well, we leave you with the complex reality of balancing serious human health risks against the safety of the animals that share our homes. The science gives us the mechanisms, but you must evaluate your own household's capacity for protocol adherence.
Ultimately, you have to look at your living space and decide if it is truly an environment where you can maintain a flawless containment zone day in and day out, despite exhaustion, busy schedules, and, well, human error.
Because if you decide to bring the hazard inside, you are no longer just a pet owner. You are the manager of a very delicate and very fragile biological boundary.